Yeah. Hi everyone, Orange Man Almost Gone here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Oneohtrix Point Never album, Magic Oneohtrix Point Never. This is the latest LP from prolific composer, producer, sonic alchemist, Daniel Lopatin, aka Oneohtrix Point Never. This, I believe, is his fourth full-length LP with the legendary Warp Records, and the project seems like a pretty huge concept for him, an artistic self-portrait of sorts, maybe? The record's title, flow, and various interludes are all deeply inspired by the world of radio. Pretty interesting we're finally getting a deep dive on something like this, especially considering the Oneohtrix Point Never name is a play on a radio station's frequency numbers anyway. Now, when I understood this was the conceptual direction of this new album, that excited me because personally I do have a lot of passion for the world of radio. Ever since, really, I had a little boombox that I could tape my favorite songs off the airwaves with. I went on to do broadcasting school in my teens, managed a college radio station, interned at stations with various formats, news talk, just pop radio. I interned at an NPR station, which I stayed there for years. And when I was much younger, I feel old saying this, radio was always at least part of my musical diet, from pop stations and top 40 stations to rock and hip hop stations, college stations, community stations too. One local to me has some of the best and cool obscure programming every month, WPKN, they rule. I mean, obviously the internet is now the music powerhouse of the modern era, but I still do have a personal soft spot for radio. And Daniel's love of radio manifests here in a series of tracks that run a gamut of sounds and aesthetics that he's indulged in over the course of his very long career. On this thing we get neo-psych ballads, ambient meditations, plunderphonic passages, tracks that have more pop leanings too. It's like we're getting the hits across Daniel's discography, but they're all filtered through this nostalgic lens, plus they're being presented as if we are slowly gliding from sound to sound like they're stations on a radio dial. I think you could only catch these vibes in a radio market smack dab in the middle of a utopia future society, or in a nostalgic dream world in Daniel's head where he comes up with these pillowy reinterpretations of formative music experiences he's had listening to the radio. Now, as I implied earlier, the tracks on this project are a real mixed bag. There's not a ton of sonic and aesthetic cohesion sometimes, outside of just trying to sound as varied as possible. On paper, I love the concept, especially since Daniel is responsible for some of my favorite records of the 2010s, and also considering the amount of impact he's had on various music genres over the years, though there is a shocking lack of vaporwave on this thing. But while I do love the ideas behind this LP, I have to say I think the execution leaves a lot to be desired. The result of going in this direction, I think, is a track list with a very fragmented flow, and with each song being in a somewhat isolated state, there's not a lot of reinforcement of anything here. Plus, when looking at many of these pieces on a micro level, I don't think Daniel is necessarily dropping his best work. In fact, I Don't Love Me Anymore, I think, is one of his worst songs to date. Terrible vocal processing over a neo-psych mash of warbly sonic junk. Mediocre tune too, and stylistically it sounds like krautrock meets pop punk meets Tame Impala and some bad AI-generated pop. I guess part of me appreciates the attempt to make something that sounds like a horrendously warped memory, but honestly, it's just something I'd rather forget. The rest of the track list sways between songs that either have pop or ambient leanings. Auto and Allo features a lot of elaborate sound design in the first leg. Partially it sounds like a pop song trying to fight its way through competing radio signals or something, eventually settling down into this ambient ballad loaded with plucky tones, some eerie processed vocals too. It's pretty pretty while it's on, but the very abrupt ending leaves me sort of cold. The following Long Road Home seems almost like a continuation of the Age of era. The synth strings, the alien vocals, it's futuristic, it's regal, but maybe with more of a pop edge this time around, which doesn't necessarily make it that much more interesting. Bo Echo is a short instrumental passage that reads almost like a R+7 leftover, but pieces of its mix are being fed through this really weak radio signal. It's grainy, it's distorted, it's kind of veering in and out of frame. Meanwhile, these distorted elements are being smothered a little bit with these euphoric synth swells. It's not my favorite cut here, but it does have an interesting mix of textures and does provide a transitional moment for some of the strongest ambient pieces on the record. The multi-phased The Weather Channel, for example, does sound sort of like a Weather Channel music bed. If it were broadcasting from, again, an idyllic utopia where the weather year-round is a perfect, mild, sunny 70 degrees. Now, there are some interesting and unexpected passages that come after this, though, including some Returnal-esque drones, as well as ambient noise and chatter. Then, finally, a hefty, monotone Nolan B. Roland rap verse that takes things up on the back end, that flows very lethargically over these twittering beats that have a real 80s sheen to them. Honestly, it sounds like something out of a Dean Blunt record. Then the following No Nightmares reinforces some of these aesthetics, extending those 80s vibes into a blissful wall of new ageisms, propelled with linear grooves and lead vocals from The Weeknd. Sure, the melodies and structures are a bit dodgy, but the piece does still feel like you're listening to a memory come together. Regardless, a potent and beautiful vibe rings through, and it still manages to be a highlight for me, which was also the case for Tales from the Trash Stratum, which features a wonderful display of sound play and texture, the curious sporadic ambient tones, pops, delays. There's quite a bit to it, and yet it feels like Daniel is working with Eno's baseline concepts for ambient music, but making them maximal for an oversaturated information age. The plunderphonic intro of IMAGO brings me back to Daniel's Replica days, as do the cycling swells of tones that happen again and again and again. They're wavy, they're ghostly, and they get clearer and more intense with each repetition. The track seems to tie into the record's overall concept really well too, as the sounds seem to get more and more distorted, like you're losing a radio signal. As this is happening, these gorgeous orchestral arrangements start zooming in as if we are picking up a new signal or something, like two different songs from two different stations, but somehow they're working together and harmonizing. Now, the final leg of the record I am a little mixed on. Lost But Never Alone is yet another song with a strong lead vocal that sounds like it's heavily warped, as if it's coming off of an old cassette, but also coming off of a bad radio signal. I think the manipulations are impressive, as are the guitar solos and grand crescendo of instrumentation at the end, but at the end of the day, I'm not very crazy about the song itself. Then Wave Idea almost feels like an odd man out on the record, because not only does it lack some of the weird aesthetic manipulations that so many other songs here have, but it's really just a bland drone marked with what sounds like birds tweeting, as well as, I guess, cuckoo clocks going off. But nothing special does end things off on a relatively strong note. It is a somber piece of ambient balladry with some of the most moving vocal melodies on the entire record. In fact, I would say this is one of the better vocal performances. Despite all of the heavy manipulations on this vocal, it still packs quite an emotional punch. Meanwhile, the instrumental is orbited by all of these sounds that seem almost self-referential to earlier moments on the record. To put it simply, I'll say I enjoyed this record, but only a little bit. There are certainly some highlights here, and I love the concept. I love the ambition of what Daniel tried to do on this record, but I just don't think this is his best material to date. And considering how retrospective this project is supposed to be, it doesn't even cover as much ground in Daniel's back catalog as it could or really should. Feeling a decent 2 strong 6 on this one. Tran. Zishin, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate rate it. You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Oneohtrix Point Never, forever.